Hello, welcome back to Insomnia History, where we explore the darkest and most thrilling stories from the past to light up your night. Before we charge into battle, don't forget to like, subscribe, and ring the bell, because every click gives us the motivation to keep going, sharing more jaw-dropping tales, night after night. Now, let's sail back to the age of the Vikings, to a time when warriors transformed into beasts on the battlefield. Men who fought with such fury, they were said to feel no pain, no fear. The Viking Berserkers weren't just warriors. They were living legends of rage and chaos. Are you ready to unleash the beast? Let's get started. The year is 793 CE. The peaceful monastery of Lindisfarne on the northeast coast of England awakens to an unprecedented horror. From the morning mist, long ships emerge like sea serpents, their dragon-headed prows cutting through the waves. The monks have little time to comprehend what is happening before the air fills with war cries. Among the raiders are men who seem less than human, more like beasts of prey. They fight with a ferocity that defies understanding, impervious to pain, wild-eyed and foaming at the mouth. These are the Berserkers, the elite shock troops of the Viking Age, and this raid marks the beginning of nearly 3 centuries of Norse terror across Europe. The Viking Age, traditionally bookended between the Lindisfarne raid in 793 and the Battle of Stamford Bridge in 1066, was an era of unprecedented expansion by Scandinavian peoples. From their northern homelands in modern-day Denmark, Norway, and Sweden, the Vikings ventured forth across seas and rivers, reaching as far as North America to the west, Russia to the east, and the Mediterranean to the south. They came as raiders, traders, settlers, and conquerors, forever changing the face of medieval Europe. But within this tapestry of Norse history, few figures stand out with such vivid and terrifying clarity as the Berserkers. These warriors represented the most extreme expression of Viking martial prowess, shrouded in mystique and supernatural terror. They were not merely soldiers but living weapons, embodiments of chaos unleashed upon the battlefield. The earliest written descriptions of Berserkers come to us from the pens of their enemies and victims. The Frankish monk Abbo of Fleury, describing the Viking siege of Paris in 885-886, writes of warriors who howled like beasts, immune to fire and iron, their bodies possessed by demonic spirits. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle similarly describes raiders who fought as if seized by madness, caring nothing for their lives. Yet it is in the Norse sagas, composed centuries after the Viking Age, but drawing on oral traditions dating back to that time, that we find the most detailed accounts of these warriors. The Ynglinga Saga, compiled by the Icelandic historian Snorri Sturluson around 1225, tells us, Odin's men went without mail coats and were mad as dogs or wolves, bit their shields, and were strong as bears or bulls. They slew men, but neither fire nor iron could hurt them. This is called Berserker Gang. What exactly was this Berserker Gang, this battle frenzy that transformed men into something both more and less than human? The sagas describe a state of altered consciousness that came upon these warriors before and during battle. Their bodies would tremble, their teeth chatter, and their faces swell and change color. They would roar like wild animals, bite the edges of their shields, and cast aside their armor in displays of supernatural invulnerability. In this state, they were said to possess the strength of many men and feel no pain from wounds that would incapacitate or kill an ordinary warrior. The fear these men inspired cannot be overstated. In an age when battle was already a terrifying prospect of close-quarters combat with edged weapons, the Berserkers represented something beyond the normal scope of warfare. Imagine standing in a shield wall, your comrades pressed close on either side, watching as these half-naked, howling figures charge toward you, with seemingly no concern for their own survival. They neither slowed nor faltered when struck, continuing to fight even with grievous wounds. To face such opponents must have seemed like confronting not men, but demons. In the cultural landscape of the Viking world, Berserkers occupied a complex and ambivalent position. They were valued for their fighting prowess and often served as the personal guards of kings and chieftains. Harald Fairhair, the first king to unite Norway in the late 9th century, reportedly had a personal retinue of berserkers who helped him secure his conquests. The 10th century Danish king Harald Bluetooth similarly employed these elite warriors. Yet, even among their own people, berserkers inspired a mixture of awe and dread. The sagas frequently depict them as problematic figures outside of battle, prone to violence and difficult to control. Their usefulness in war was counterbalanced by the danger they posed in times of peace. They were, in many ways, living weapons that could not always be safely sheathed. The rituals and practices surrounding berserkers were closely tied to the worship of Odin, the chief deity of the Norse pantheon. Odin was not only a god of wisdom and poetry, but also of battle, death, and ecstatic states. He was called Father of the Slain and Lord of the Hanged, names that reflected his association with battlefield carnage and sacrificial death. The berserkers were considered to be his special warriors, dedicated to him through rituals we can only partly reconstruct from the fragmentary evidence that survives. What we do know is that the relationship between berserkers and Odin was understood as a form of possession. When the battle frenzy came upon them, it was believed that Odin himself had entered their bodies, temporarily displacing their human consciousness with his divine fury. This explains the superhuman abilities attributed to them, as well as the altered states of consciousness they exhibited. They were not merely skilled human warriors, but vessels for divine power. The animal symbolism associated with berserkers further underscores their liminal, not quite human status. Most common animals linked to them were bears and wolves, both apex predators that inspired fear and respect in Norse culture. The name berserker itself may derive from bear shirt, berserker, suggesting warriors who wore bear pelts, or who transformed spiritually into bears during battle. A related group, the Ulfhanar, wolfcoats, were similarly associated with wolves, the animals sacred to Odin. This animal association wasn't merely symbolic. The sagas describe berserkers howling like wolves or roaring like bears, moving on all fours, and biting with their teeth in battle. They were believed to take on not just the strength but the very nature of these animals, existing in a space between the human and animal worlds, between the mundane and the divine. The tactical application of berserkers in battle made expert use of their psychological impact. Viking commanders would often place these warriors at the front of their formations, using them as shock troops to break enemy lines and spread terror through opposing forces. Their immunity to pain and fear made them ideal for this role, as they could maintain their assault even in the face of resistance that would deter ordinary warriors. Historical accounts suggest that berserkers were particularly effective against opponents who had never encountered them before. The initial Viking raids on England, France, and other parts of Europe benefited enormously from the psychological shock these warriors created. Christian soldiers, facing what appeared to be men possessed by demons who could not be stopped by normal means, often broke and fled rather than stand their ground. Even as the Viking Age progressed and their enemies became more familiar with Norse tactics, berserkers continued to play a crucial role in major battles. At the Battle of Stamford Bridge in 1066, which traditionally marks the end of the Viking Age, a single berserker is said to have held the narrow bridge against the entire English army for a time. killing dozens of attackers before being finally overcome by a soldier who floated under the bridge and thrust a spear up through the planking. The reality behind the legends of berserkers has been debated by historians and archaeologists for generations. Were they truly capable of entering altered states that granted them immunity to pain and supernatural strength? Or were the stories of their powers exaggerated by both the Vikings themselves as psychological warfare and by their terrified enemies? The answer likely lies somewhere in the middle. Modern science recognizes that extreme stress and psychological conditioning can indeed produce altered states of consciousness in which pain is not felt and physical strength can temporarily exceed normal limits. The human body, under the influence of adrenaline and other stress hormones, is capable of feats that would seem impossible under normal circumstances. Additionally, there is compelling evidence that berserkers may have used various substances to induce their battle frenzy. The fly, agaric mushroom, Amanita muscaria, which grows throughout Scandinavia, produces effects that match many descriptions of berserker gang: increased strength, altered perception, flushed skin, and diminished sensitivity to pain. Other possibilities include certain types of bog myrtle or henbane, plants known to have psychoactive properties and associated with Norse rituals. Beyond substances, the role of ritual and psychological conditioning cannot be overlooked. Warriors dedicated to Odin would have undergone intensive training, not just in combat skills, but in mental techniques to induce the desired state of battle frenzy. These might have included rhythmic chanting, hyperventilation, self-induced hypnotic states, and other practices designed to suppress normal consciousness and access deeper, more primal mental states. Whatever the exact mechanisms behind their frenzy, the berserkers represent an extreme expression of the warrior ethos that defined Viking culture. This was a society that placed enormous value on martial prowess and courage in battle. The afterlife that awaited the worthy, Valhalla, was reserved specifically for those who died with weapons in hand. In such a culture, the berserker stood as the ultimate warrior, one who had transcended normal human limitations and approached the divine through the path of battle. The legacy of these warriors extends far beyond their historical period. They have entered our collective imagination as symbols of unrestrained fury and battlefield prowess. The very word berserk has become part of our common vocabulary, describing any state of uncontrolled rage or frenzy. Yet, this modern usage captures only a fraction of what these warriors represented in their own time. The berserker was not merely angry or out of control, but transformed, elevated, or reduced to something other than human. As we venture deeper into the world of the berserkers, in the coming episodes, we will explore the mysteries that still surround them. How did they induce their battle frenzy? What was their true role in Viking society? Were they honored warriors or feared outsiders? And what can their existence tell us about the human capacity for transformation under extreme circumstances? The berserkers stand at the intersection of history and myth, their true nature obscured by time and the limitations of our sources. Yet, through careful examination of the evidence that remains, we can begin to glimpse the reality behind the legend, a reality perhaps more fascinating and complex than the myths that have grown up around them. The word berserker itself contains mysteries as deep as the northern forests where these warriors once roamed. To understand these fearsome fighters, we must first unravel the linguistic puzzle embedded in their very name. In Old Norse, the language of the Vikings, compound words often revealed essential truths about their subjects. The term berserker, plural berserkir, has been the subject of scholarly debate for centuries, with two primary interpretations emerging from the linguistic fog of history. The most widely accepted etymology breaks the word into ber and serker, meaning bear shirt or bear coat. This interpretation suggests warriors who either wore the pelts of bears into battle or who symbolically took on the essence of these powerful animals. Bears held special significance in Norse culture, representing not only tremendous physical strength, but also the liminal space between the human and animal worlds. The bear was an animal that could stand upright like a man, possessed near human intelligence, and commanded respect through raw power rather than speed or cunning. An alternative interpretation, championed by some scholars, breaks the word into ber meaning bear and serker meaning shirt or coat, suggesting warriors who fought without armor or even without clothing. This reading aligns with descriptions in the sagas of berserkers, who cast aside their protective gear before battle, either as a display of supernatural invulnerability or in the throes of their battle frenzy. The 13th century Icelandic historian Snorri Sturluson seems to support this interpretation in his Ynglinga saga when he writes that berserkers went without mailcoats. The linguistic ambiguity may actually reflect a deeper truth about these warriors. Both interpretations capture essential aspects of the berserker phenomenon. They were indeed associated with bears, adopting their strength and fury, while also frequently casting aside conventional protection to fight in a state of battle madness. The dual meaning embedded in their name mirrors their dual nature as men who became something else, something simultaneously more and less than human during combat. The connection between berserkers and bears extends beyond mere etymology. Archaeological evidence from the Viking Age includes numerous artifacts depicting warriors with bear imagery. The Torslanda plates, metal dies from 7th century Sweden used for stamping decorative helmet panels, show figures in what appears to be bearskin headdresses, dancing with spears in poses suggestive of ritual combat. Similar imagery appears on the famous Sutton Hoo helmet from Anglo-Saxon England, suggesting that warrior cults associated with bears predated the Viking Age and were widespread across Germanic cultures. Physical evidence of bear worship among Norse warriors includes amulets shaped like bear claws or teeth, often found in the graves of high-status males. These talismans suggest that the connection to bears was not merely symbolic, but deeply spiritual, invoking the animal's power as a form of protection or blessing. The archaeological record also includes actual bear claws and pelts in warrior graves, physical manifestations of the bond between elite fighters and these powerful animals. The bear was not the only animal associated with berserkers. A related warrior cult, the Ulfhanar or wolfcoats, drew their power from wolves rather than bears. While berserkers and Ulfhanar are sometimes treated as distinct groups in the sagas, they shared many characteristics, including their battle frenzy and their connection to Odin. Some scholars suggest that the distinction between bear warriors and wolf warriors reflected different tactical roles or fighting styles, with the heavier, stronger bear warriors acting as frontline shock troops, while the faster, more agile wolf warriors operated in coordinated packs on the battlefield flanks. This dual animal symbolism reflects a fundamental aspect of Norse religious thought. The boundary between human and animal was considered more permeable than in many other cultural traditions. Transformation, or shape-shifting, features prominently in Norse mythology and folklore. Odin himself was said to be able to change his form at will, and many of the gods had animal associations, or could take animal form. In this context, berserkers represented not an aberration, but an extreme expression of a widely accepted spiritual concept. The connection between berserkers and the god Odin stands at the heart of their cultural and religious significance. Odin, also known as Woden, Wotan, or by dozens of other names across Germanic cultures, was a complex deity associated with wisdom, poetry, death, and battle. Unlike Thor, who represented straightforward martial strength, Odin embodied the more unpredictable, magical, and terrifying aspects of warfare. He was a god of frenzy and inspiration, a master of ecstatic states that transcended normal consciousness. In the Jofaginning section of the Prose Edda, Snorri Sturluson describes Odin. When he sat with his friends, he gladdened the spirits of all of them. But when he was at war, his demeanor was terrifyingly grim. This dual nature, capable of both wisdom and terrible fury, made him the perfect patron for warriors who similarly straddled the line between controlled violence and unleashed frenzy. Odin was known by many names that reflected his warrior aspect, including Hertir, god of armies, Sigfr, father of victory, and perhaps most tellingly, Ogi, the furious one. The name Ogi shares its root with the modern English word woad or wood, meaning mad or frenzied. This etymological connection between the god's name and concepts of madness or altered states underscores the fundamental nature of the Berserker experience. When a warrior entered the Berserker state, he was not merely adopting a battle technique, but entering into communion with his god, allowing Odin's divine fury to possess him completely. Numerous sagas describe Berserkers as Odin's men, suggesting a special dedication or consecration to this deity above others in the Norse pantheon. The Historia Norwegi, a Latin history of Norway composed around 1170, explicitly states that Berserkers were possessed by the demon of Odin. From a Christian perspective, writing centuries after the Viking Age, the author interprets the Berserker state as demonic possession. From the perspective of the Berserkers themselves, however, this possession would have been understood as a divine blessing, a temporary merging with the god of battle. The specific rituals through which warriors dedicated themselves to Odin and prepared for the Berserker state remain largely unknown to us. The sagas, written centuries after the conversion of Scandinavia to Christianity, provide only glimpses of pre-Christian religious practices, often filtered through a Christian lens. Archaeological evidence, while valuable, can tell us little about the specifics of spiritual practices that left no material trace. However, by piecing together fragmentary evidence from various sources, we can begin to reconstruct something of these lost rituals. One key element appears to have been animal mimicry. The Ynglinga saga tells us that berserkers howled like dogs or wolves and bit their shields. This behavior suggests rituals designed to facilitate a psychological identification with the totem animal, helping the warrior to shed his human identity and take on animal characteristics. Similar practices have been documented in warrior cults across many cultures, from the leopard men of West Africa to the jaguar warriors of Mesoamerica. The use of intoxicants or psychoactive substances likely played a role in inducing the berserker state. While much speculative ink has been spilled on this topic, several candidates emerge from the available evidence. The fly agaric mushroom, Amanita muscaria, with its distinctive red cap spotted with white, grows throughout Scandinavia and produces effects that match many descriptions of berserker gang. Increased strength, altered perception, sensory distortion, and diminished pain sensitivity. The mushroom's bright red and white coloration also aligns with Odin's associations with red, blood, and white, the color of his beard in many descriptions. Other potential substances include bog myrtle myrica which was used in brewing and has mild psychoactive properties, and henbane hyoscyamus niger, a powerful hallucinogen associated with witchcraft throughout Northern Europe. Any of these, alone or in combination, could have helped induce the altered state described in the sagas. It's worth noting, however, that while chemicals might have facilitated the berserker state, the cultural and religious framework within which these substances were used would have been equally important in shaping the experience. Beyond substances, physical techniques for altering consciousness may have included hyperventilation, rhythmic movement, and self-induced hypnotic states. These methods for achieving trance states are documented across many shamanic traditions worldwide and leave no archaeological trace. The sagas describe berserkers trembling and chattering their teeth before battle, physical manifestations consistent with hyperventilation and its effects on the central nervous system. The relationship between berserkers and shape-shifting beliefs merits special attention. While the sagas rarely claim that berserkers physically transformed into animals, they do suggest a form of spiritual metamorphosis. The Volsunga saga tells of warriors who could change their shapes and whose nature was not as that of men. Eagle's saga describes a berserker who began to howl loudly and bit into his shield, behaviors suggesting an identification with wolves. This concept of spiritual shape-shifting reflects a worldview in which the boundaries between human, animal, and divine realms were permeable. Humans could, through proper ritual and in specific contexts, take on qualities of animals or gods. The berserker, in his battle frenzy, existed in this liminal space, neither fully human nor fully animal, but something in between. This state, terrifying to outsiders, represented to the Norse a form of transcendence, a temporary escape from the limitations of human existence. The literary depictions of berserkers in the Icelandic sagas, composed primarily in the 13th and 14th centuries, provide our most detailed accounts of these warriors. However, these texts were written centuries after the Viking Age and in a Christian context. They represent not contemporary accounts but a cultural memory shaped by time and changing values. By the time the sagas were written down, berserkers had already passed into legend. In the sagas, berserkers often play the role of antagonists rather than heroes. They appear as stock characters, violent and uncontrollable men who serve as obstacles for the saga's protagonists to overcome. This negative portrayal likely reflects the changed cultural context of Christian Iceland, where the pre-Christian religious practices associated with berserkers were viewed with suspicion or outright hostility. It may also reflect historical reality, as berserkers, with their extreme behavior and violent tendencies, may indeed have been problematic figures even within Viking society. Egil's saga provides one of our most complex literary portrayals of the berserker phenomenon. The protagonist, Egil Skallagrimsson, comes from a family with berserker tendencies. His father, Skallagrim, and grandfather, Kveldulf, Evening Wolf, both display characteristics associated with berserkers, including superhuman strength and episodes of uncontrollable rage. Egil himself, while never explicitly called a berserker, inherits this family trait, experiencing moments of battle fury, where his strength increases and his appearance changes. Yet Egil is also a poet, a man of words, as well as violence, embodying the dual nature of Odin as both battle god and master of poetry. Through this complex characterization, the saga suggests that the berserker trait, while dangerous, could also be channeled into culturally valuable expressions when properly controlled. This nuanced portrayal hints at how berserkers might have been viewed during the Viking Age itself, as figures of both fear and respect. Visual representations of berserkers in Norse art are relatively rare, but significant. The most famous appears on one of the Torslanda plates mentioned earlier, showing a dancing warrior wearing what appears to be a wolf or bear skin, accompanied by a spear-carrying figure in a horned helmet, possibly representing Odin. Similar imagery appears on helmet plates from Vendel-era Sweden, 550-800 CE, suggesting that warrior cults associated with animal transformation predated the Viking Age proper. Stone carvings from Gotland, Sweden, dating to the 8th century, show warriors dancing with spears in poses similar to those on the Torslanda plates. These images likely depict ritual dances associated with Odin worship and warrior initiation. The consistency of this imagery across centuries and different media suggests a long-standing and widespread cultural practice, rather than isolated incidents. The Oseberg Tapestry, a remarkable textile found in a 9th century ship burial in Norway, includes scenes that may depict a religious procession associated with warrior cults. Among the figures in this procession are men in animal costumes, possibly representing berserkers or related ritual practitioners. The tapestry's imagery, while enigmatic, provides rare evidence of how these warrior cults may have operated in ceremonial contexts outside of battle. As we examine these ancient images and texts, a picture emerges of berserkers not merely as battlefield shock troops, but as participants in a complex religious and cultural system. Their fury was not random, but channeled. Not merely a battle tactic, but an expression of deep spiritual beliefs about the relationship between humans, animals, and gods. The name they bore, whether interpreted as bear shirts or bear shirts, captured this dual identity as both bestial and vulnerable, superhuman and stripped of normal human restraints. The legacy of this name extends beyond the Viking Age into our modern vocabulary. When we describe someone as going berserk, we invoke, however distantly, this ancient tradition of sacred fury. The modern usage has lost much of its original religious and cultural context, reduced to a simple descriptor for uncontrolled rage. Yet in this linguistic fossil, a trace remains of a time when fury could be sacred, when the line between human and animal was not fixed but fluid, and when warriors sought the favor of gods through the surrender of their very humanity. The morning fog clung to the marshlands as the Saxon villagers awoke to the distant sound of horns. By the time the warning bells began to ring, the dragon-prowed ships had already beached on the shoreline. Among the Norse raiders who poured forth were figures that seemed to defy the very nature of men. Bare-chested, despite the biting cold, their eyes wild and unfocused, they did not march in formation, but loped forward like predators. As they approached the hastily assembled village defense, witnesses claimed these warriors began to undergo a transformation. Their bodies trembled violently. They gnashed their teeth until foam flecked their beards. Some fell to all fours, moving like the bears whose pelts they wore draped across their shoulders. And then, with howls that froze the blood of even hardened Saxon fighters, they charged. This scene, reconstructed from accounts in both Norse sagas and the terrified writings of their victims, captures the essence of the Berserker gang. The battle frenzy that made Berserkers the most feared warriors in Dark Age Europe. The term Berserker gang literally translates as going berserk, the state of battle madness that defined these warriors. But what exactly happened during this transformation? How did ordinary men become something that their enemies could scarcely recognize as human? According to the sagas, the onset of Berserker gang followed a predictable pattern. First came physical trembling, so violent that the warrior's weapons rattled in his hands. His face would swell and change color, turning first deathly pale, and then dark red or purple as blood rushed to the surface of the skin. The Ynglinga saga describes how they howled like wild beasts, bit their shields, and were as strong as bears or bulls. This shield biting, mentioned in numerous sources, seems to have been both a ritualistic behavior and a practical technique for building battle rage, possibly by inducing hyperventilation or stimulating the release of adrenaline through self-inflicted pain. As the frenzy took deeper hold, the berserker's normal human consciousness appeared to recede, replaced by something more primal. In this state, he no longer responded to pain, fear, or exhaustion, the natural limitations that constrain human fighting ability. The Heimskringla describes King Harald Fairhair's berserkers, in battle, they were subject to fits of frenzy. They would howl like dogs, foamed at the mouth, and gnawed the iron rim of their shields. While in this condition, they were, it is said, invulnerable to steel or fire. But when the fit had passed, they were weak and powerless. This temporary invulnerability represents one of the most remarkable aspects of the Berserker phenomenon. Multiple independent sources, from Norse sagas to foreign chronicles, attest to Berserkers continuing to fight despite wounds that would immediately incapacitate or kill an ordinary warrior. The 12th century Danish historian Saxo Grammaticus writes of Berserkers who were seized with such a frenzied passion that they would bite their shields, swallow burning coals, and rush through fires. No force of steel could hurt them. Only their own fury could end their lives. Modern medical science offers several possible explanations for this apparent invulnerability. The human body's response to extreme stress includes the release of adrenaline and endorphins, powerful hormones that can temporarily block pain signals, increase strength, and accelerate reaction time. Under sufficient stress, the conscious mind's awareness of injuries can be completely suppressed until the immediate danger has passed. Soldiers in modern combat have reported similar experiences, continuing to fight effectively despite severe injuries they only became aware of after the battle ended. If this natural stress response was further enhanced by psychoactive substances, ritualistic conditioning, or self-induced hypnotic states, it could account for the seemingly supernatural abilities attributed to Berserkers. Their immunity to pain would have appeared miraculous to opponents who lacked understanding of these physiological mechanisms. The Berserkers' enhanced strength, another commonly reported characteristic, also has potential scientific explanations. Under normal conditions, the human body imposes limitations on muscle exertion to prevent self-injury. These limitations can be temporarily overridden during extreme stress, allowing for feats of strength far beyond normal capability. Cases of individuals lifting vehicles to save trapped victims exemplify this phenomenon in the modern world. The cost of such temporary superhuman strength is severe. Muscle tears, ligament damage, and complete exhaustion once the stress response subsides, which aligns with descriptions of Berserkers becoming weak and powerless after their frenzy pass. The psychological impact of Berserkers on their opponents cannot be overstated. In an era when most battles were fought at close quarters by disciplined formations, the Berserkers represented a terrifying aberration. Rather than maintaining the shield wall that characterized most Dark Age combat, they broke formation, attacked individually, and fought with a wild abandon that defied conventional tactics. This psychological warfare aspect was likely intentional. The Arabic diplomat Ibn Fadlan, who encountered Vikings on the Volga River in the 10th century, described warriors who would work themselves into a frenzy before battle specifically to intimidate their enemies. The bizarre behaviors associated with Berserker gang, howling, foaming at the mouth, biting shields, served not only ritual purposes but practical ones, creating a fearsome spectacle that could break enemy morale before physical combat even began. The tactical deployment of Berserkers in Viking armies demonstrates a sophisticated understanding of battlefield psychology. Rather than being scattered throughout the forces, Berserkers were typically concentrated in elite units used at crucial moments to break enemy formations. Archaeological evidence from mass graves associated with Viking battles shows that initial attacks often targeted enemy leaders, a tactic that Berserker units would have been ideally suited to execute, cutting through defensive formations to eliminate command structures. The Jomsvikings, an elite mercenary brotherhood active in the Baltic region during the late Viking Age, included Berserkers among their ranks and were renowned for their fearlessness and fighting prowess. Their code explicitly forbade showing fear or retreating, even against overwhelming odds. At the Battle of Hjörungavágr, around 986 CE, Jam's Vikings reportedly faced execution after capture with such stoicism that they impressed even their enemies, with one warrior allegedly asking to be beheaded from the front so he could see the stroke coming. In large-scale engagements, berserkers often formed the vanguard of Viking armies, leading the initial charge to create gaps in enemy formations that conventional forces could then exploit. The Battle of Stamford Bridge in 1066, which marked the effective end of the Viking Age, featured a famous last stand by a single berserker who held the narrow bridge against the entire English army, reportedly killing up to 40 men before being finally overcome by a soldier who floated beneath the bridge and thrust a spear up through the wooden planks. This battle also illustrates the vulnerability of berserkers when faced with opponents who understood their tactics. By the 11th century, European armies had developed specific counter-tactics for dealing with berserker charges. Rather than meeting them head-on, disciplined forces would open their formations to let the berserkers pass through, then close ranks and attack them from behind. Isolated and surrounded, even berserkers could be overcome by coordinated attacks from multiple directions. The weapons and fighting style preferred by berserkers reflected their unique approach to combat. While the typical Viking warrior fought with shield, spear, and sword in close formation, berserkers often abandoned shields entirely, preferring two-handed weapons like the Danish axe that maximized offensive power at the cost of defense. This massive axe, with a blade sometimes exceeding 30 centimeters in length, mounted on a shaft over a meter long, could cleave through shields and armor alike, capitalizing on the berserker's aggression and heightened strength. Archaeological evidence from Viking Age burials supports this association between elite warriors and specific weapons. High-status male graves often contain distinctive weapon combinations that may identify their occupants as berserkers or other specialized warriors. These include unusually large axes, ceremonial spears, and in some cases, fragments of bear or wolf pelts that may represent remnants of ritual garments. The physical appearance of berserkers added to their terrifying presence. Many fought bare-chested or wearing only light tunics, despite the cold northern climate. This practice served multiple purposes. Practically, it allowed maximum freedom of movement during combat. Psychologically, it displayed confidence and fearlessness. Ritually, it may have symbolized the warrior's liminal status, no longer fully human, and thus beyond human concerns like cold or pain. Facial expressions played a crucial role in the berserkers' intimidation tactics. The sagas describe them grimacing in unnatural ways, baring their teeth like animals, and fixing their gaze in what was called the evil eye. This intense, unblinking stare was believed to have magical properties, weakening opponents or instilling paralyzing fear. Modern psychology recognizes that direct, aggressive eye contact triggers instinctive fear responses in humans, making this an effective intimidation technique, regardless of any supposed magical properties. Vocalizations completed the berserkers' sensory assault on their enemies. Rather than the coordinated war cries used by conventional forces, berserkers emitted continuous animalistic sounds, howling, roaring, and grunting throughout battle. These sounds served both to maintain their own altered state and to disorient opponents. The psychological impact of facing a warrior who fights while making inhuman noises should not be underestimated, particularly in an age when such behavior would have seemed evidence of possession or supernatural transformation. The berserkers' fighting technique itself differed markedly from conventional Viking combat. While standard infantry training emphasized disciplined formation fighting, berserkers employed a more individualistic, frenetic style. They would spin leap and whirl through enemy ranks, striking from unexpected angles and maintaining constant movement. The 13th century Icelandic law speaker, Sturla Jorgarsson, describes berserkers hewing about them on both sides, creating space around themselves through continuous offensive action, rather than defensive positioning. This whirlwind fighting style, combined with apparent immunity to pain, made berserkers especially deadly in the close-quarters combat that characterized medieval warfare. Their unpredictable movements disrupted the rhythm of more conventionally trained opponents, whose fighting styles relied on established patterns of attack and defense. Against berserkers, these conventional techniques proved inadequate, as the normal feedback loop of action and reaction broke down when facing an opponent who did not respond to injury in expected ways. The berserker's role in major Viking campaigns and battles is well documented, though often embellished in later retellings. During the initial raids on England in the late 8th and early 9th centuries, berserkers spearheaded attacks on monasteries and coastal settlements, maximizing the psychological impact of these early encounters. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle records how defenders would often flee rather than face these devil's men who felt no wound. As Viking activity evolved from raiding to conquest and settlement in the mid-9th century, berserkers remained crucial to their military success. The great heathen army that invaded England in 865 included berserker units under the command of Ivar the Boneless and his brothers. This army conquered much of northern and eastern England, establishing the region known as the Danelaw, where Scandinavian law and custom prevailed. In Francia, modern France, berserkers participated in the siege of Paris in 885-886, where their fearsome reputation preceded them. The Frankish defender Abbo of Saint-Germain-des-Prés wrote of Norse warriors who rushed at the walls like wild beasts, caring nothing for wounds if only they might break through. Despite being ultimately unsuccessful, this siege demonstrated the Vikings' ability to project power deep into continental Europe, with berserkers serving as their elite shock troops. The Battle of Malden, in 991, commemorated in a famous Old English poem, describes how Viking berserkers challenged conventional Anglo-Saxon battle tactics. The poem recounts how the Viking force, including warriors who fought with unusual ferocity, manipulated the English commander Bartnoth into abandoning his advantageous position through appeals to his sense of honor, resulting in an English defeat. While the poem does not explicitly name berserkers, its description of warriors who rushed forward eager, cared not for life aligns with berserker characteristics. Berserkers also featured prominently in the complex power struggles among Scandinavian kingdoms during the late Viking Age. Harald Hardrada, the last great Viking king, maintained a personal guard of berserkers during his campaigns across Europe and the Mediterranean before his death at Stamford Bridge in 1066. The battle formations he employed placed these elite warriors at strategic points where their shock value and fighting prowess could have maximum impact. 1. Beyond open battle, berserkers played significant roles in smaller-scale combat scenarios. The sagas frequently depict them participating in holmgang, a formalized duel used to settle disputes in Norse society. In this context, their battle frenzy gave them a decisive advantage over opponents fighting in a normal state of consciousness. Several sagas describe how even renowned warriors would refuse holmgang challenges from known berserkers, preferring to concede property or honor rather than face certain death. The aftermath of Berserkergang presents one of the most intriguing aspects of this phenomenon. After the battle frenzy subsided, berserkers experienced a period of profound exhaustion and vulnerability lasting several days. During this recovery period, they were described as being weaker than ordinary men, barely able to defend themselves. This cycle of superhuman power followed by debilitating weakness suggests a physical rather than purely supernatural explanation for their abilities. Modern medical understanding of extreme stress responses includes similar patterns of post-exertion exhaustion, as the body's resources are depleted by intense activity. This vulnerability period necessitated special arrangements for berserkers within Viking military organizations. They required protection from their own comrades during recovery and campaign. Timing needed to account for their cycles of strength and weakness. Some sagas suggest that kings who employed berserkers would stagger their use, ensuring that some were always battle-ready while others recovered. This careful management of elite warriors demonstrates the sophisticated military thinking behind Viking success. As opponents became more familiar with berserkers over the course of the Viking Age, specific countermeasures evolved. By the 11th century, European military commanders had developed tactics specifically designed to neutralize the berserker advantage. These included using missile weapons to target them before close combat, setting ambushes to attack them during their vulnerable recovery periods, and training soldiers in specific techniques for fighting opponents who did not respond normally to wounds. The gradual decline of berserkers as an effective military force coincided with broader changes in European warfare, including the increasing importance of cavalry and the development of more sophisticated armor. As battles became larger and more complex, the individual prowess of berserkers became less decisive than disciplined formation fighting and combined arms tactics. Additionally, the spread of Christianity throughout Scandinavia undermined the pagan religious practices that underpinned the berserker tradition. The last historical references to active berserkers come from the 12th century, by which time they had largely been relegated to folklore rather than military reality. Icelandic law codes from this period specifically outlaw going berserk, suggesting that while the practice still existed, it had become socially unacceptable in the now Christianized Norse world. What had once been a sacred warrior tradition had become criminalized, its practitioners viewed as dangerous anachronisms rather than elite warriors. Yet, even as the living tradition of berserkers faded, their impact on military history remained profound. They had demonstrated the effectiveness of psychological warfare, the power of elite shock troops, and the military potential of altered states of consciousness. These lessons were not lost on subsequent military traditions, even as the specific religious and cultural context of the berserkers themselves was forgotten. When the battle horns fell silent and the blood-soaked fields emptied, what became of the berserkers? These warriors who embodied the most extreme aspects of Viking martial culture did not simply vanish between conflicts. They existed within the complex social fabric of Norse society, occupying a unique and often ambivalent position that reflected both the value placed on their battlefield prowess and the fear their volatile nature inspired. To truly understand the berserker phenomenon, we must look beyond the frenzy of combat to examine their place in the everyday world of the Vikings. The social status of berserkers varied considerably across the Viking Age and between different regions of Scandinavia. In the earlier period, particularly during the 8th and 9th centuries, berserkers appear to have enjoyed high status and considerable privilege. The Icelandic historian Snorri Sturluson, writing in the Heimskringla, describes how King Harald Fairhair of Norway maintained a personal retinue of berserkers who served as his elite guard and received special treatment, including larger shares of plunder and prestigious seating positions at feasts. This close association between berserkers and royalty reflected their value as both military assets and symbols of power. King, who commanded berserkers, demonstrated not only his wealth and influence, but also a connection to Odin, the patron deity of these warriors. In a culture where political legitimacy was closely tied to religious authority, this divine association strengthened a ruler's claim to leadership. Several early kings of Sweden, Norway, and Denmark claimed descent from Odin himself, making berserkers natural additions to their entourage as fellow devotees of the god of battle. The privileged position of royal berserkers came with substantial material benefits. Archaeological evidence from high-status warrior graves dating to this period reveals exceptional wealth compared to common fighters. These graves often contain not only superior weapons and armor, but also imported luxury goods, gold and silver ornaments, and other markers of elite status. While we cannot definitively identify these graves as belonging to berserkers specifically, the correlation between elite warrior status and exceptional wealth is clear in the archaeological record. Beyond their role as royal guards, berserkers served as champions in the retinues of jarls, earls, and other high-ranking nobles. In this capacity, they functioned as both military assets and status symbols, their presence demonstrating their patron's importance and power. The relationship between a lord and his berserkers was formalized through gift exchange, oath-taking, and mutual obligation, following the same pattern that governed lord-retainer relationships throughout medieval Germanic societies. The saga literature preserves accounts of these relationships, depicting berserkers receiving gold arm rings, prestigious weapons, and land grants from their lords in exchange for their service. Eagle's Saga describes how the grandfather of its protagonist, Kveldulf Evening Wolf, served King Harold Fairhair but maintained a degree of independence unusual for royal retainers, suggesting the special status accorded to those with berserker abilities. However, not all berserkers served in royal or noble retinues. The sagas also describe freelance berserkers who operated independently, selling their services to the highest bidder or using their fearsome reputation to extort wealth from local communities. These unattached warriors represented a significant social problem, as their volatile nature and exceptional combat skills made them dangerous when not under the control of legitimate authority. Several sagas feature storylines involving these problematic freelance berserkers. In Grettir's saga, the protagonist confronts two berserkers who have been terrorizing a local community, demanding money and forcing a farmer to give up his daughter in marriage. Similarly, Erbygja saga describes a berserker named Halli, who challenges men to duels with the stipulation that the loser forfeit all his property, using his extraordinary fighting abilities to accumulate wealth through what amounts to legalized robbery. These accounts reveal the darker side of the berserker phenomenon. While their abilities made them valuable in warfare, these same qualities could become profoundly disruptive to social order during peacetime. A warrior who could not or would not control his battle fury, who lived in a perpetual state between human and animal, represented a fundamental challenge to the structures of law and custom that governed Norse society. This ambivalence is reflected in the legal status of berserkers, which evolved significantly over the course of the Viking Age. Early legal codes make little specific mention of berserkers, suggesting their behavior, while perhaps problematic, was not yet considered outside the bounds of acceptable warrior conduct. By the late Viking Age, however, specific laws had emerged to control berserker behavior and limit the social disruption they could cause. The Gulathing Law, one of the oldest Norwegian legal codes, dating from around 900 CE, but written down in the 12th century, contains provisions that may have been aimed at controlling berserkers. It specifies harsh penalties for unprovoked violence and creates legal mechanisms for dealing with individuals whose behavior consistently threatens community peace. While not mentioning berserkers by name, these laws address precisely the kind of disruptive behavior attributed to them in the sagas. More explicit legal restrictions appear in later Icelandic law. The Gragas, Iceland's medieval legal code, specifically outlaws going berserk, prescribing full outlawry, the most severe punishment in Norse society, effectively a death sentence for anyone exhibiting berserker behavior. This law, dating from after Iceland's conversion to Christianity around 1000 CE, reflects both the Christianization of Norse society and increasing efforts to control disruptive warrior behavior as the Viking Age gave way to more settled medieval kingdoms. The marriage patterns of berserkers offer another window into their social position. In the sagas, berserkers are frequently depicted seeking marriages with the daughters of prosperous farmers or chieftains, often using intimidation to force the father's consent. These marriage requests are invariably portrayed negatively, with the berserker presented as an unwelcome suitor whose proposal cannot be safely refused due to his fearsome fighting abilities. This narrative pattern suggests that while berserkers possessed significant physical power, they lacked the social status that would make them acceptable marriage partners for women from respectable families. Their attempts to marry into established families represent efforts to gain legitimate social standing to match their martial prowess, efforts that the saga narratives consistently portray as inappropriate transgressions of proper social boundaries. The saga literature's treatment of these marriage conflicts reveals much about how berserkers were viewed by the time these stories were written down. They are almost invariably portrayed as antagonists whose defeat by the saga's hero restores proper social order. The berserker suitor represents a threat not just to the individual woman, but to the proper functioning of society itself, a disruption that must be corrected through the hero's intervention. This negative portrayal may partly reflect the Christian perspective of the saga writers, who viewed the pagan religious practices associated with berserkers as demonic or immoral. However, it likely also preserves older social attitudes toward warriors, whose volatile nature made them dangerous social actors despite their military value. The ability to channel battle fury that made berserkers invaluable in war made them problematic in peace. The precise social background from which berserkers were drawn remains somewhat unclear from our sources. Some scholars suggest they originated primarily from the free farmer class, carls, rather than from the nobility, jarls, or the unfree, thralls. This middle-class origin would explain both their need to seek status through military service and their attempts to marry into more established families. However, the sagas also describe some berserkers of noble birth, suggesting that the ability or choice to go berserk cut across class lines. What seems more relevant than social origin was the religious dedication that defined the berserker path. These warriors were set apart not primarily by birth, but by their special relationship with Odin and their cultivation of specific martial and spiritual practices. In this sense, becoming a berserker represented a vocation or calling rather than an inherited status, though certain families might develop reputations for producing warriors with berserker tendencies. The religious dimension of berserker identity significantly complicated their position following the Christianization of Scandinavia. Beginning in the late 10th century and continuing through the 11th, the Norse lands gradually converted to Christianity, a process that fundamentally altered their religious, cultural, and political landscape. For berserkers, whose identity was inextricably linked to the worship of Odin, this religious transformation posed an existential challenge. The new Christian authorities viewed the berserker state as a form of demonic possession rather than divine inspiration. The Historia Norwegie, written around 1170, explicitly describes berserkers as possessed by the demon of Odin, reflecting this Christianized interpretation of the older pagan practice. From being sacred warriors touched by divine fury, berserkers were recast as victims of satanic influence, their altered state a spiritual affliction rather than a blessing. This religious reframing had profound implications for the social status of berserkers. Practices that had once conferred prestige and spiritual authority became evidence of moral corruption and demonic influence. The special relationship with Odin that had set berserkers apart as elite warriors now marked them as adherents to a forbidden religion, practitioners of condemned rituals. Legal prohibition followed religious condemnation. 1015, King Olaf Haraldsson of Norway, later Saint Olaf, outlawed berserkers throughout his kingdom as part of his campaign to Christianize Norway. Similar prohibitions appeared throughout Scandinavia as Christian kings consolidated their power, often using opposition to pagan practices as justification for extending royal authority over previously independent regions and groups. Archaeological evidence confirms this decline in the berserker tradition. Warrior graves from the 11th century onward show increasing conformity to Christian burial practices, with weapons positioned differently and pagan grave goods becoming less common. The bear and wolf symbolism associated with berserkers gradually disappears from funerary contexts, replaced by Christian imagery and artifacts. This suppression of the berserker tradition coincided with broader changes in Scandinavian military organization. As the Viking Age gave way to the medieval period, the emphasis on individual warrior prowess diminished in favor of more organized, professional military structures. The berserker, as the ultimate expression of individualistic warrior culture, became increasingly anachronistic in this changing military landscape. Despite their declining official status, berserkers did not immediately disappear from Norse society. Evidence suggests that the tradition continued underground in some regions, particularly in remote areas where royal and ecclesiastical authority remained weak. Occasional references to berserker-like behavior appear in Scandinavian sources through the 12th century, suggesting the persistence of older warrior practices despite official prohibition. The transformation of berserkers from elite warriors to outlawed troublemakers also appears in the changing nature of saga depictions. In earlier narratives set during the height of the Viking Age, berserkers may be fearsome, but are often portrayed with a degree of respect for their courage and fighting skills. In later sagas, or those set in more recent time periods, they become increasingly one-dimensional antagonists, obstacles for the hero to overcome rather than worthy opponents. This narrative evolution reflects not just changing attitudes toward berserkers specifically, but a broader cultural transformation in how Norse society understood its own warrior past. As Scandinavia integrated into Christian European civilization, its earlier pagan warrior culture became simultaneously a source of cultural identity and an embarrassing reminder of barbaric origins that needed to be disavowed. The berserker thus became a liminal figure in cultural memory, representing both the glorious martial past of the Norse people and the uncivilized practices they had supposedly outgrown through Christianization. This ambivalent status helps explain why berserkers remained such powerful figures in Norse literature, even as the actual practice of berserker gang was condemned and suppressed. Even in their decline, berserkers maintained a complex relationship with political power. While officially condemned, some evidence suggests that Scandinavian kings continued to employ warriors with berserker-like qualities, in particular military roles, well into the medieval period. The 13th century kings' sagas describe elite royal guards who display characteristics reminiscent of the earlier berserker tradition, though without the explicit religious associations or the term berserker itself. This persistence points to the practical military value of berserkers that survived even after their religious and cultural context had been dismantled. The battlefield advantages of warriors capable of fighting with unusual ferocity and apparent immunity to pain remained relevant even as the spiritual framework that had originally supported these abilities was replaced. The economic activities of berserkers outside of warfare remain somewhat obscure in our sources. The sagas rarely depict them engaged in normal productive labor, instead portraying them primarily as fighters who support themselves through military service, raiding, or various forms of extortion. This portrayal may reflect literary convention rather than historical reality, as saga narratives naturally focus on dramatic conflicts rather than mundane activities. Archaeological evidence provides some corrective to this limited literary portrait. Warrior graves that might be associated with berserkers often contain tools related to crafts like metalworking, wood carving, or shipbuilding alongside weapons, suggesting that even elite warriors typically practiced peacetime occupations. The distinction between warrior and craftsman was likely less absolute in Viking society than the sagas might suggest, with most men, regardless of their fighting abilities, contributing to the productive economy when not at war. The relationship between berserkers and other specialized roles in Norse society also deserves consideration. The Vikings recognized various categories of exceptional individuals, including skalds, poets, sire practitioners, those who performed a form of shamanic magic, and law speakers, those who memorized and recited legal codes. While these roles were distinct, individuals sometimes combined multiple specialized functions. Egil Skallagrimsson, whose family displayed berserker tendencies, was also a renowned poet, embodying the dual aspects of Odin as god of both battle frenzy and poetic inspiration. This combination of roles was not coincidental, but reflected the fundamental Norse understanding of inspired states, whether expressed through the furor of battle or the composition of verse, as gifts from the divine. The social expectations placed on berserkers extended beyond their military function. As elite warriors often closely associated with leadership figures, they played important roles in various public ceremonies and rituals. Archaeological and literary evidence suggests their participation in religious observances dedicated to Odin, ceremonial games demonstrating martial prowess, and formal diplomatic functions where their presence symbolized their lord's military power. During royal assemblies or things, the legislative and judicial gatherings of Norse society, berserkers might serve as enforcers of their lord's will, or as living symbols of his authority. Their physical presence could influence proceedings without any actual violence, as few would willingly oppose a chieftain backed by warriors known for supernatural fighting abilities and unpredictable behavior. This ceremonial and symbolic role continued even as the actual military significance of berserkers declined. Long after organized berserker units had disappeared from Scandinavian armies, rulers might maintain guards with berserker-like appearance or reputation, trading on the psychological impact of these traditional warrior figures, even when their religious and cultural context had been lost. The final disappearance of berserkers from Scandinavian society coincided with the region's full integration into medieval European civilization during the 12th and 13th centuries, as feudal institutions replaced older Norse social structures, as plate armor and cavalry tactics transformed warfare, and as Christian religious dominance erased the last vestiges of pagan practice. The social space that had allowed berserkers to exist finally closed completely. Yet, even in disappearing, they left an indelible mark on Norse society and on our understanding of Viking culture. The berserker, with all his contradictions, sacred yet feared, valuable yet dangerous, human yet animal, embodied fundamental tensions within the Viking worldview. Through studying these extraordinary warriors, we gain insight not just into Norse military practices, but into deeper questions of identity, consciousness, and the boundaries of human experience that preoccupied the Viking mind. In a remote fjord in Norway, archaeologists excavating a 10th century settlement uncovered a peculiar ceramic vessel. Inside, chemical analysis revealed trace residues of organic compounds that, even after a millennium, retained their molecular signature. Among these compounds were muscimol and ibotenic acid, psychoactive chemicals found in Amanita muscaria, the distinctive red and white spotted mushroom known commonly as fly agaric. Nearby lay the remains of a warrior, buried with an unusually large axe and fragments of what may have been a bear pelt. The proximity of these elements, psychoactive substances, weapons, and animal symbolism, provides tantalizing physical evidence for what many scholars have long suspected. The legendary fury of the Berserkers may have had a chemical foundation. The question of how Berserkers achieved their extraordinary battle state has fascinated historians, archaeologists, and scientists for generations. How did ordinary men transform into warriors who fought with superhuman strength, felt no pain, and behaved more like wild animals than disciplined soldiers? The Berserker phenomenon represents a unique intersection of history, pharmacology, psychology, and neuroscience. Modern research in these fields has generated several compelling theories about the mechanisms behind Berserker Gang, each with its own supporting evidence and limitations. The mushroom hypothesis remains one of the most enduring scientific explanations for the Berserker state. Amanita muscaria grows abundantly throughout Scandinavia and has been used in shamanic rituals by northern Eurasian cultures for thousands of years. When consumed, this mushroom produces effects that align remarkably well with Berserker behavior. Increased strength, diminished pain sensitivity, altered perception, hyperthermia, explaining why Berserkers often fought bare-chested in cold weather, auditory and visual hallucinations, and erratic, sometimes aggressive behavior. The ethnomycologist R. Gordon Wasson, who extensively studied the ritual use of mushrooms across cultures, noted striking similarities between reported effects of Amanita muscaria and descriptions of Berserker Gang in Norse literature. The mushroom's bright red cap with white spots also carries symbolic significance, as these colors, red for blood and white for death, were closely associated with Odin, the patron deity of Berserkers. Chemical analysis of the mushroom reveals why it might have been particularly effective for warrior applications. Unlike many other psychedelics that primarily affect serotonin receptors, Amanita muscaria's active compounds, muscimol and ibotenic acid, primarily affect GABA receptors in the brain. GABA, gamma-aminobutyric acid, is the main inhibitory neurotransmitter in the central nervous system, essentially acting as the brain's brake pedal. By modulating GABA receptors, muscimol can simultaneously reduce anxiety while disinhibiting behavior, precisely the combination a warrior would need to overcome natural fear responses while fighting with uninhibited aggression. Historical evidence for mushroom use among Berserkers remains circumstantial but compelling. Several archaeological sites associated with Odin worship have yielded residues, suggesting the ritual use of Amanita muscaria. Rock carvings from the Bronze Age through the Viking period occasionally depict figures holding mushroom-like objects during what appear to be ceremonial scenes. Additionally, linguistic connections between berserkers and mushrooms appear in folk terminology across Scandinavia, where certain mushroom varieties are still known by names referencing madness or frenzy. The mushroom theory faces several significant challenges, however. Amanita muscaria's effects, while potentially useful in combat, include significant coordination impairment and unpredictable hallucinations that could be counterproductive in battle. Additionally, the dosage window between desired effects and debilitating toxicity is relatively narrow, making consistent battlefield application difficult. Critics argue that Berserker's consistently effective combat performance seems incompatible with the variable and potentially incapacitating effects of mushroom intoxication. Beyond Amanita muscaria, several other natural substances have been proposed as potential chemical triggers for Berserker Gang. Bog myrtle, Myrica gale, a plant commonly used in Norse brewing, contains compounds that can produce mild stimulant and mood-altering effects. When added to alcohol, these compounds might enhance aggression and reduce pain sensitivity, without causing the more severe impairments associated with Amanita muscaria. Henbane, Hyoscyamus niger, another plant native to Scandinavia, contains the anticholinergic compounds hyoscyamin and scopolamine. These substances can produce delirium, increased heart rate, dilated pupils, and reduced pain sensation. Archaeological evidence confirms henbane's presence in several Viking settlements, and its seeds have been found in contexts suggesting ritual rather than purely medicinal use. The stinking hellebore, Helleborus foetidus, represents another candidate. This plant contains cardiac glycosides that increase heart rate and can produce feelings of strength and aggression at sublethal doses. Several medieval accounts describe warrior plants with effects consistent with hellebore, and its distribution matches the Norse geographical range. Alcohol itself should not be overlooked in this chemical inventory. While certainly not sufficient alone to explain the extreme berserker state, alcohol's disinhibiting effects could have amplified other substances or psychological techniques. Specialized brewing techniques incorporating various psychoactive plants might have produced beverages specifically designed to induce combat frenzy. Several archaeological finds of brewing equipment from high-status warrior contexts suggest connections between specialized alcoholic preparations and elite warrior practices. The role of animal products in berserker preparations deserves consideration as well. Several saga references describe berserkers consuming animal blood or organs before battle, particularly those of bears or wolves. Modern science recognizes that certain animal glands, particularly adrenal glands, contain high concentrations of hormones like epinephrine, adrenaline, that could theoretically enhance combat performance if consumed. While the effectiveness of orally ingested hormones is questionable due to digestive breakdown, this practice might have had some physiological basis beyond purely symbolic significance. Moving beyond chemical explanations, modern psychology offers several compelling theories about the berserker state that don't require external substances. The human stress response, particularly the sympathetic nervous system's fight-or-flight reaction, produces many effects consistent with berserker behavior: increased strength, reduced pain sensitivity, tunnel vision, time distortion, and suppression of rational thought in favor of instinctive action. Under normal circumstances, this stress response is self-limiting, as the parasympathetic nervous system eventually counteracts these effects to prevent physiological damage from prolonged activation. However, specific psychological techniques can potentially override these limitations, allowing for extended periods of sympathetic dominance. Modern research on extreme athletes, special forces soldiers, and practitioners of certain martial arts traditions demonstrates that trained individuals can consciously influence their autonomic nervous system functions to a remarkable degree. Self-induced hypnotic states represent another psychological mechanism that might explain berserker gang. Clinical hypnosis research confirms that deeply hypnotized subjects can demonstrate altered pain perception, enhanced strength, and selective sensory filtering similar to that described in Berserkers. If Viking warriors developed cultural techniques for rapid self-hypnosis before battle, this could account for many aspects of the Berserker phenomenon without requiring external substances. The anthropologist Felicitas Goodman's research on religious trance states provides another relevant framework. Goodman documented how specific body postures, breathing patterns, and rhythmic stimulation, particularly drumming, could reliably induce altered states of consciousness across various cultures. Several postures depicted in Viking art, particularly the Berserker dance shown on certain archaeological artifacts, bear striking similarities to trance-inducing postures Goodman identified in other shamanic traditions. The rhythmic aspects of Berserker preparation should not be underestimated. Multiple saga descriptions mention Berserkers producing constant low growling sounds or chanting before battle. Modern neuroscience has demonstrated that rhythmic sound patterns can entrain brainwaves, shifting consciousness from normal beta wave activity toward the theta states associated with trance and altered perception. The shield-biting behavior frequently attributed to berserkers might have served not just as intimidation, but as a form of rhythmic stimulation, creating resonant vibrations that facilitated trance induction. Collective psychology offers additional insights into the berserker phenomenon. Combat units throughout history have employed synchronized movement, chanting, and shared rituals to create a group mind state that enhances cohesion and fighting effectiveness. When individuals participate in such collective activities, their sense of personal identity can temporarily diminish, reducing individual fear responses and pain perception, while increasing willingness to take risks for the group. Anthropologists call this state communitas, a profound sense of social connectedness that transcends normal boundaries of the self. This collective dimension might explain how berserker units maintained their effectiveness even in prolonged campaigns. Rather than requiring constant chemical stimulation, they could have relied on socially reinforced altered states, with the group dynamic maintaining the battle trance through mutual reinforcement. This model aligns with descriptions of berserker units serving together under specific commanders, rather than operating as isolated individuals. Modern combat psychology research provides further parallels to the berserker state. Studies of soldiers in extreme combat situations document dissociative states where fighters report feeling detached from their bodies, experiencing time distortion, and acting with seemingly automatic efficiency. Neuroimaging studies suggest these states involve temporary deactivation of brain regions responsible for self-reflection and pain processing, while enhancing activity in primitive motor control and threat response areas. These same neural mechanisms could have underpinned the berserker experience. The neuroscientist V.S. Ramachandran's research on temporary brain reorganization under extreme stress offers another relevant framework. His studies demonstrate that the brain can rapidly reconfigure neural networks in response to trauma or threat, temporarily shutting down non-essential functions to enhance survival-critical capability. This neuroplasticity could explain berserkers' ability to transcend normal human limitations in battle, essentially entering a specialized neural configuration optimized for combat at the expense of higher cognitive functions. The psychology of identity transformation provides yet another perspective. Across many cultures, warriors adopt alternative identities during combat, becoming ancestors, spirits, or animals, not merely as metaphor, but as lived psychological reality. This phenomenon, termed identity dissociation by psychologists, allows individuals to access behavioral patterns and emotional states normally inhibited by their everyday identity. For berserkers, temporarily becoming the bear or wolf through ritual preparation might have facilitated access to more aggressive, pain-resistant aspects of themselves normally kept under cultural and psychological restraint. Moving into more controversial territory, some researchers have proposed that certain mental health conditions might have predisposed individuals to berserker behavior. Conditions featuring hypomania, such as bipolar disorder, can produce periods of increased energy, reduced need for sleep, heightened confidence, and diminished pain sensitivity, all characteristics attributed to berserkers. If Viking culture channeled individuals with such conditions into warrior roles, their natural tendencies could have been ritualized and directed toward military purposes. Epilepsy, particularly temporal lobe epilepsy, presents another medical possibility. The prodromal, pre-seizure, phase of certain epileptic conditions can include sensations of unusual strength, altered perception, and intense emotional states. Historical figures like Julius Caesar and Napoleon Bonaparte, both known for exceptional battlefield courage and occasional seemingly superhuman energy, have been retrospectively diagnosed with forms of epilepsy by some medical historians. Certain genetic conditions affecting adrenaline regulation, such as pheochromocytoma, cause episodes of extreme strength, aggression, and pain resistance that parallel berserker descriptions. While these conditions are rare, individuals affected might have been preferentially selected for elite warrior roles precisely because of these unusual capabilities. The hereditary nature of berserker abilities, mentioned in some sagas, like Eagle's Saga, where berserker traits run in families, supports potential genetic factors. The modern understanding of post-traumatic stress disorders adds another dimension to berserker psychology. Combat trauma can produce hyperarousal states, where individuals remain in heightened alertness, experiencing exaggerated startle responses and episodes of rage or dissociation. If Viking warriors experienced significant combat trauma, highly likely given their violent lifestyle, some might have developed PTSD-like conditions that, in their cultural context, were interpreted as special battle abilities rather than psychological injuries. Each of these theories has strengths and limitations. When applied to the berserker phenomenon, the most compelling scientific explanation likely involves a combination of factors rather than a single mechanism. Cultural conditioning, psychological techniques, and possibly chemical assistance probably work together within a religious framework that gave meaning to these experiences. For instance, a berserker might have undertaken ritual preparation involving mild psychoactive substances, perhaps alcohol infused with bog myrtle or small amounts of Amanita muscaria, combined with rhythmic breathing, chanting, and movement patterns designed to induce altered consciousness. These practices would occur within a cultural context that expected and valued the resulting state, interpreting it as divine possession by Odin rather than mere intoxication or psychological technique. The evidence supporting various berserker theories comes from diverse sources. Archaeological findings provide physical evidence of substances and rituals potentially associated with berserker practices. Chemical analysis of residues from drinking vessels found in warrior contexts has identified compounds from several psychoactive plants. Skeletal remains occasionally show patterns of healed injuries that would have been extraordinarily painful, suggesting individuals with unusual pain tolerance consistent with berserker descriptions. Experimental archaeology has contributed valuable insights by testing the effects of proposed berserker substances and techniques under controlled conditions. Researchers have documented the physiological and psychological effects of traditional preparations made according to ancient recipes, finding that some indeed produce states resembling aspects of berserker game. Similarly, experiments with the rhythmic breathing and movement patterns depicted in Viking art have demonstrated their effectiveness in altering consciousness in predictable ways. Comparative anthropology provides another source of supporting evidence. Warrior traditions from other cultures, such as the Hawaiian Koa warriors, Zulu Amabutho, and Japanese samurai, developed techniques for inducing battle trances with remarkable similarities to berserker practices. These cross-cultural parallels suggest that humans across different societies independently discovered similar methods for transcending normal limitations during combat. The most significant challenge in evaluating berserker theories lies in the historical distance separating us from the Viking Age. Without the ability to directly observe berserkers or interview them about their experiences, we must rely on indirect evidence filtered through cultural biases, both ancient and modern. The saga accounts, while invaluable, were written centuries after the height of the berserker phenomenon by Christian authors with potentially negative views of pagan practices. Additionally, the berserker tradition likely evolved considerably over the 3 centuries of the Viking Age, adapting to changing warfare conditions and cultural influences. What began as a shamanic warrior tradition closely tied to Odin worship may have gradually transformed into a more secular combat technique as Norse society changed. This evolution complicates attempts to develop a single comprehensive explanation for the berserker phenomenon. The placebo effect and expectancy also deserve consideration in any scientific analysis of berserkers. Modern neuroscience has demonstrated the remarkable power of belief to alter physical performance and pain perception. If Viking warriors firmly believed that certain rituals would make them invulnerable and superhumanly strong, these expectations alone could produce measurable effects on their combat performance through well-documented neurobiological mechanisms. This psychological dimension helps explain why berserker techniques might have remained effective, even if the specific substances or rituals changed over time. The cultural framework, the shared belief in Odin's ability to possess his chosen warriors and grant them extraordinary powers, provided a consistent psychological foundation that could accommodate variations in the specific methods used to achieve the berserker state. Modern military interest in the berserker phenomenon adds a contemporary dimension to this historical question. Several special forces units have researched historical warrior traditions, including berserkers, seeking techniques for enhancing combat performance without technological assistance. While these investigations remain largely classified, occasional publications suggest that certain ancient methods for altering combat consciousness have been validated by modern scientific testing and incorporated into specialized training programs. These contemporary applications highlight an important ethical dimension of berserker research: the ability to temporarily override normal human limitations, particularly empathy, fear, and pain response, carries profound implications for both military effectiveness and potential psychological consequences. The sagas frequently describe berserkers suffering after their battle frenzy passed, experiencing extreme exhaustion and sometimes psychological disturbances that resemble what we now recognize as post-traumatic stress. This ancient pattern reflects a neural truth rediscovered by modern neuroscience. Prolonged suppression of normal regulatory functions exacts a biological price. The neurochemical mechanisms that enable extraordinary performance, whether induced by substances, psychological techniques, or extreme stress, create imbalances that must eventually be corrected, often resulting in significant physical and psychological aftereffects. The scientific exploration of berserkers ultimately reveals as much about our continuing fascination with the limits of human potential as it does about these ancient warriors themselves. The berserker represented a deliberate venture beyond normal human boundaries, a weaponization of altered consciousness that simultaneously inspired awe, terror, and ambivalence, even within Viking society. In studying these extraordinary warriors through the lens of modern science, we confront fundamental questions about consciousness, identity, and the malleability of human nature that remain as relevant today as they were 1,000 years ago on the blood-soaked battlefields of the Viking Age. On a cold autumn day in 1030, a massive battle unfolded near Stiklestad in central Norway. King Olaf Haraldsson, attempting to reclaim his throne and complete the Christianization of Norway, faced a coalition of Norwegian nobles and farmers. Among the opposing forces were fighters described in later accounts as wolfcoats, who fought with extraordinary ferocity, helping to ensure Olaf's defeat and death. This battle, recorded in multiple independent sources and commemorated in both poetry and prose, provides one of our most reliable historical attestations of berserker-type warriors participating in a documented historical event. The historical study of berserkers presents unique challenges. Unlike kings, bishops, or even ordinary farmers, these warriors left relatively few direct traces in the conventional historical record. They existed in a liminal space, extraordinary enough to be remembered in story and song, yet seldom holding the kind of formal positions that generated written records. To reconstruct their reality, historians must piece together evidence from diverse sources, each with its own limitations and biases. The earliest written references to berserkers come not from the Norse themselves, but from their victims and trading partners. Frankish chronicles describing Viking raids in the late 8th and early 9th centuries occasionally mention warriors who fought with unusual ferocity and seemed impervious to pain. While these accounts don't use the term berserker specifically, their descriptions align with later Norse sources, suggesting that the phenomenon predated its formal documentation. The Byzantine Emperor Constantine VII Porphyrogenitus, writing in the mid-10th century, describes his Varangian Guard, elite Norse mercenaries, who served as the emperor's personal bodyguards, as including warriors who become possessed in battle and are as strong as wild beasts. This reference suggests that berserkers or warriors with similar characteristics had entered the international military marketplace. Their reputation extending far beyond Scandinavia to the sophisticated imperial court of Constantinople. Arab sources provide another external perspective. Ibn Fadlan, whose detailed account of encountering a Viking funeral on the Volga River in 921 CE is one of our most valuable sources on Viking customs, describes warriors who would work themselves into states of frenzy before battle. The Persian historian Ibn Miskawayh, recording a Viking attack on the city of Aleppo in 943 CE, similarly notes the presence of fighters who care not whether they lived or died and fought with an abandon that terrified defenders. These non-Norse sources are particularly valuable because they predate the more extensive Norse literature about berserkers and are free from the romantic reinterpretation that affected later Scandinavian accounts. When multiple independent cultural traditions record similar observations about Norse warriors, the historical credibility of these accounts is significantly strengthened. The primary Norse sources for berserkers fall into several categories, each with distinct characteristics and limitations. The skaldic poetry, composed during the Viking Age itself, provides our earliest indigenous references. Unlike the later prose sagas, these complex formal poems were composed contemporaneously with the events they describe, often by poets who witnessed the battles firsthand. Their strict metrical requirements made them resistant to later modification, preserving original content even when transmitted orally for generations before being written down. Several skaldic poems from the 9th and 10th centuries mention berserkers or Ulfheinar, wolfcoats, in the context of specific historical battles. The Haraldsvætti, composed around 900 CE by the skald Thorbjorn Hornklofi in honor of King Harald Fairhair, contains this famous description. The berserkers roared where the battle was raging, the wolfcoats howled and shook their spears. This contemporary reference confirms that berserkers existed as a recognized warrior type during the height of the Viking Age, serving in the forces of historically attested kings rather than merely in later legend. The Eddic poems, anonymous compositions preserved in 13th century manuscripts, but containing material that linguistically dates to the pre-Christian period, provide another source. While less historically specific than skaldic verse, these mythological and heroic poems contain numerous references to berserker-like behaviors and establish the deep connection between Odin and frenzied warriors. The Havamal, a poem presented as Odin's own words, contains several stanzas describing how the god grants exceptional abilities to his chosen warriors. Runic inscriptions, carved during the Viking Age itself, occasionally provide tantalizing references to warrior cult practices. The Björketorp runestone in Sweden, dating to approximately the 7th century, contains a curse formula that some scholars interpret as referring to ritualistic battle frenzy. While few runic inscriptions mention berserkers explicitly, several commemorate individuals with names or titles suggesting connections to bear or wolf symbolism. The Icelandic sagas, written primarily in the 13th and 14th centuries, but based on oral traditions stretching back to the Viking Age, provide our most detailed accounts of berserkers. These prose narratives fall into several categories, each with different historical value. The king's sagas, such as Heimskringla by Snorri Sturluson, focus on the lives of Scandinavian rulers and often contain material corroborated by skaldic poetry and external sources. The family sagas, Islandingasugur, describe the lives of the first settlers of Iceland and their descendants, combining historical events with literary embellishment. Egil's Saga, one of the most historically credible of the family sagas, presents a complex portrayal of berserker traits. The protagonist's grandfather, Kveldulf, Evening Wolf, is described as subject to shapeshifting, growing stronger as evening approached. His son Skallagrim and grandson Egil inherit this trait, experiencing episodes where their appearance changes, their strength increases, and they lose normal self-control. The saga's nuanced treatment suggests a genuine historical memory of individuals with berserker-like characteristics rather than merely stock literary figures. Grettir's Saga contains a famous episode where the protagonist confronts two berserkers who have been terrorizing a farming community. The detailed description of their behavior, falling into trembling fits before battle, howling, and fighting with inhuman strength, provides one of our most vivid literary portraits of the berserker phenomenon. Similarly, Eyrbyggja Saga and Vatnsdæla Saga contain significant episodes featuring berserkers, often portrayed as antagonists challenging the social order. The saga evidence must be approached cautiously, however. By the time these stories were written down, berserkers had already passed into legend, and their portrayal was inevitably shaped by the Christian perspective of the writers and their audiences. The consistently negative portrayal of berserkers in these later works likely reflects changing attitudes rather than historical reality. Additionally, literary conventions and stock character types influenced how berserkers were depicted, potentially obscuring their actual historical role. The conversion of Scandinavia to Christianity, occurring primarily during the 10th and 11th centuries, created a significant dividing line in how berserkers were understood and documented. Pre-Christian sources view their abilities as divine gifts from Odin, while post-conversion accounts reinterpret the same phenomena as demonic possession, or increasingly, as mere literary devices. This religious filter complicates historical analysis, as even supposedly factual accounts became vehicles for promoting Christian values over pagan traditions. Law codes provide another textual window into the historical reality of berserkers. The Gulathing law from Norway and the Gragas from Iceland both contain provisions that may reference berserkers, though often indirectly. The specific outlawing of going berserk in later medieval Scandinavian legal codes confirms that the practice continued long enough after Christianization to require formal prohibition, suggesting it was more than merely a literary memory. Beyond textual sources, archaeology offers tangible evidence related to the berserker phenomenon. While we cannot directly identify berserker remains with certainty, several categories of archaeological findings provide insights into warrior cult practices that align with berserker descriptions in the written sources. Weapon graves, burials containing extensive military equipment, occasionally include unusual elements that may connect to berserker practices. Several high-status warrior burials from across Scandinavia contain animal remains, particularly bear and wolf elements, positioned in ways suggesting ritual significance rather than merely decorative functions. A 10th century grave from Birka, Sweden, contained a warrior buried with bear claws arranged around the body, potentially the remains of a bear pelt that had clothed the deceased. Similar finds from Denmark include warrior graves containing wolf bones positioned near the human remains. In some cases, the animal teeth appear to have been worn as pendants or amulets, suggesting a symbolic identification between the warrior and the predator. These archaeological patterns align precisely with the literary descriptions of berserkers and Ulfhenar adopting bear and wolf identities respectively. Iconographic evidence provides another archaeological window into berserker practices. Metal figurines, helmet plates, and stone carvings from the Viking Age occasionally depict warriors in animal skins or with animal features. The most famous examples come from the Torslanda helmet plates from Sweden, dating to approximately the 7th century. These bronze dies, used to stamp decorative scenes onto helmet faceplates, show warriors dressed in wolf or bear skins, dancing with spears in poses suggesting ritual combat or trance induction. Similar imagery appears on the Tienvide image stone from Gotland, Sweden, which depicts a warrior wearing what appears to be an animal skin headdress. The Oseberg tapestry fragments, dating to the early 9th century, contain scenes that may depict ritual dances involving animal costumes. The consistency of this imagery across different media and regions suggests widespread cultic practices involving animal transformation, aligning with the berserker tradition described in literary sources. Battlefield archaeology occasionally provides evidence of combat behaviors that match berserker descriptions. Excavations at several Viking Age battle sites have uncovered skeletal remains showing unusual trauma patterns, including individuals who continued fighting despite catastrophic injuries that would normally incapacitate. While such findings cannot definitively identify berserkers, they confirm that the extreme combat behaviors described in the sagas were physically possible. The chemical analysis of artifacts has opened new avenues for berserker research. Residue analysis from drinking vessels found in elite warrior contexts has occasionally identified compounds from psychoactive plants known to have been available in Viking Age Scandinavia. A notable example comes from the Hochdorf chieftain's grave in Germany, though from the earlier Celtic period, showing continuity of warrior practices in Germanic regions, where drinking vessels contained residue from a mixture of alcoholic beverages and herbs with mind-altering properties. Place name evidence adds another dimension to the archaeological record. Across Scandinavia, locations with names incorporating elements like bear, Alf, or direct references to Odin, often correlate with sites showing evidence of ritual activity. These linguistic fossils preserve memories of sacred landscapes associated with warrior cult practices, creating a geography of berserker-related activities that extends beyond individual artifact finds. The timing of berserker references in historical sources reveals an interesting pattern. Mentions are most common in sources describing the early and middle Viking Age, late 8th through 10th centuries, becoming less frequent in accounts of the 11th century, and largely disappearing except as literary devices by the 12th century. This timeline correlates with the Christianization of Scandinavia and the incorporation of Norse regions into the broader European cultural and political sphere. The gradual disappearance of berserkers from historical sources doesn't necessarily indicate an abrupt end to the actual practices. Evidence suggests that elements of the tradition continued in remote areas and in transformed contexts. The royal huscarls, household troops, of later Scandinavian kings preserved some characteristics of earlier elite warrior units, though without the explicit pagan religious associations. Similarly, certain medieval Scandinavian outlaws, as described in 13th and 14th century sources, display behaviors reminiscent of the earlier berserker tradition. This continuity, through transformation, reflects a common pattern in cultural history, where outlawed practices don't simply vanish, but adapt to new contexts. The berserker tradition likely survived in fragmentary form long after its official suppression, with techniques for combat trance induction passed down through warrior lineages, even as their original religious framework was lost or disguised. The geographical distribution of Berserker references in historical sources offers additional insights. They appear most prominently in Norwegian and Icelandic texts, somewhat less frequently in Danish sources, and relatively rarely in Swedish materials. This pattern may reflect regional variations in warrior practices or differences in how extensively Christian authorities suppressed pagan traditions in different areas. Alternatively, it may simply result from the uneven preservation of historical sources across the Norse world. When we compare Berserker accounts across different source types and periods, certain core elements remain consistent while peripheral details vary. The central features, altered states of consciousness, animal associations, particularly bears and wolves, connection to Odin, superhuman combat abilities, and post-frenzy exhaustion, appear in sources ranging from contemporary skaldic verse to later saga narrative. This consistency across diverse sources strengthens the historical case for Berserkers as a genuine phenomenon rather than merely a literary invention. The historical and archaeological evidence, taken together, presents a compelling case for the historical reality of Berserkers as specialized warriors who employed altered states of consciousness in combat. While later sources undoubtedly embellished their abilities and reinterpreted their practices through changing cultural lenses, the core phenomenon appears firmly grounded in historical fact rather than pure myth. Like many aspects of the past that challenged later cultural norms, Berserkers were not so much invented as reinterpreted. Their memory transformed to serve the narrative needs of each subsequent generation. The enduring fascination with Berserkers reflects not just their dramatic qualities, but the tantalizing glimpse they offer into a fundamentally different way of understanding the relationship between mind, body, and battle. Through the fragmentary evidence they left behind, we encounter a worldview where the boundaries between human and animal, between the individual and divine possession, were understood not as fixed but fluid, a perspective that continues to challenge our modern assumptions about the limits of human consciousness and capability. In the final scene of a popular historical drama series, a lone Viking warrior stands on a narrow bridge. Stripped to the waist, despite the bitter cold, his eyes wild with battle lust, he roars defiance at the advancing enemy. As arrows pierce his flesh, he seems not to notice, continuing to swing his massive axe with supernatural strength, cutting down foes by the dozen before finally succumbing to his wounds. This dramatic representation of the famous last stand at Stamford Bridge might seem like Hollywood excess, yet it captures something essential about how modern popular culture has embraced and transformed the Berserker legacy. The journey of Berserkers from historical reality to cultural icon represents one of the most fascinating examples of how ancient warrior traditions continue to resonate in the modern imagination. Though the actual Berserkers vanished from the battlefield nearly a millennium ago, their spiritual descendants populate movies, television shows, novels, comics, video games, and music. Their image continuously reinvented to reflect each era's fascination with controlled violence, altered consciousness, and the blurring of boundaries between human and animal. Modern popular depictions of Berserkers began taking shape during the 19th century Romantic movement, when European intellectuals and artists turned to medieval and ancient sources for inspiration. The Victorian fascination with Norse mythology, exemplified by works like Sir Walter Scott's historical novels, contributed to a romanticized image of Vikings in general and Berserkers in particular. Early visual representations, such as the dramatic 1880s illustrations by Peter Nikolai Albo, established an enduring iconography of Berserkers as wild-eyed, bare-chested warriors wielding massive weapons. This romanticized vision gained further momentum through Richard Wagner's operatic cycle Der Ring des Nibelungen, 1876, which incorporated elements of Norse mythology, including warrior figures inspired by Berserkers. Wagner's musical representation of frenzy and battle madness with its crashing percussion and swirling strings, created an auditory vocabulary for berserker rage that influences soundtrack compositions for films and video games to this day. The early 20th century saw berserkers transition into popular literature through the works of authors like Robert E. Howard, creator of Conan the Barbarian. Howard's stories, beginning in the 1930s, frequently featured warrior characters who could enter states of battle frenzy, remarkably similar to Berserker Gang. Though set in fictional prehistoric worlds rather than actual Norse settings, these stories preserved core elements of the Berserker tradition. Superhuman strength during combat, immunity to pain, animal-like fury, and post-battle exhaustion. Howard's contemporary, J.R.R. Tolkien, incorporated similar concepts into his Middle-earth legendarium. Though Tolkien, as a medieval scholar, approached Norse material with more historical accuracy, his character Bjorn in The Hobbit, 1937, clearly draws on berserker traditions. A man who can transform into a bear, Bjorn enters battle with unstoppable fury, a direct literary descendant of the bear warriors of Norse tradition. This connection becomes even more explicit in Tolkien's posthumously published works, which reference bear men who fought in frenzies. The cinematic representation of berserkers began in earnest with Richard Fleischer's The Vikings, 1958, which, while taking significant historical liberties, introduced mainstream audiences to Viking warrior culture. However, it was not until the 1980s that berserkers became a staple in visual media. Films like Conan the Barbarian, 1982, though not explicitly Norse in setting, popularized the image of the muscle-bound warrior who fights with unstoppable rage, a clear berserker archetype. More directly connected to Norse themes, the Swedish film The 13th Warrior, 1999, based on Michael Crichton's novel Eaters of the Dead, features warriors who wear bear skins and fight with animal-like ferocity. Though presented within a fictionalized version of the Beowulf story, these characters clearly reference historical berserkers and introduce audiences to the connection between these warriors and animal transformation. The 21st century has seen an explosion of berserker representations across media, coinciding with renewed popular interest in Viking history. The History Channel's series Vikings, 2013-2020, features multiple characters who display berserker characteristics, most notably the character Rollo, who fights bare-chested, seems immune to pain, and enters trance-like states before battle. The series attempts a somewhat more nuanced portrayal, suggesting that the berserker state has psychological costs and showing the tensions between these warriors and the increasingly Christianized Norse society. In Robert Eggers' film, The Northman 22, berserker rituals are depicted with unusual attention to historical detail, showing warriors in animal skins performing ceremonies to invoke animal spirits before battle. The film's unflinching portrayal of both the power and the disturbing nature of these rituals represents one of the most historically informed mainstream depictions of berserkers, avoiding both romantic glorification and complete demonization. The world of video games has embraced berserkers with particular enthusiasm, as the concept naturally lends itself to gaming mechanics. The God of War series features the protagonist Kratos entering rage mode, a berserker-like state that increases damage output and provides temporary invulnerability. The Assassin's Creed Valhalla, 2020, explicitly includes berserkers as enemy types and allows players to use berserker rage abilities. Games like Skyrim include direct references with their berserker rage racial ability for orc characters, allowing temporary pain immunity and double damage output. These game mechanics reveal a key aspect of how modern media has adapted the berserker concept. By quantifying and systematizing what was originally a complex religious and psychological phenomenon, the berserker state becomes a temporary power boost with specific numerical advantages, doubled strength, immunity to status effects, and clear disadvantages, time, duration, exhaustion afterward. This gamification represents both an oversimplification of the historical reality and a remarkably effective translation of core Berserker concepts into modern entertainment frameworks. Comic books and graphic novels have similarly embraced Berserker archetypes. Marvel Comics character Wolverine, particularly when he enters his Berserker rage, draws clear inspiration from the Norse tradition, combining animal association, wolf, uncontrollable fury, and immunity to pain. The manga and anime Berserk by Kentaro Miura, despite its medieval European rather than Norse setting, takes the Berserker concept as its central theme, exploring the psychological and spiritual costs of surrendering to battle frenzy through its protagonist's guts and his cursed Berserker armor. In music, Berserkers have inspired countless metal bands, particularly within the Viking metal and folk metal subgenres. Groups like Amon Amarth, Enslaved, and Tyr frequently reference Berserkers in their lyrics and visual aesthetics. The theme of transformation through battle frenzy resonates naturally with metal's musical intensity and theatrical presentations. The song Berserker at Stamford Bridge by Amon Amarth, recounting the famous last stand of a lone Viking warrior, exemplifies how these historical accounts have been preserved and transmitted through contemporary cultural forms. Beyond explicit Viking settings, the Berserker concept has influenced broader character archetypes across popular culture. The unstoppable rage fighter appears in countless action films, from modern military characters who continue fighting despite grievous wounds to martial arts heroes who tap into animal spirits for combat power. The trope of a character removing their shirt before a particularly intense battle, while serving obvious visual purposes, also connects to the historical Berserker's rejection of normal protection in favor of furious offense. When comparing historical Berserkers to their popular culture counterparts, several key differences emerge. Perhaps most significantly, popular depictions typically secularize what was originally a deeply religious phenomenon. The historical Berserker's fury was inseparable from Norse religious practices, particularly the worship of Odin. The Berserker state was understood as divine possession, a literal entering of the god into the warrior's body. This religious dimension is usually downplayed or entirely absent in modern representations, replaced by vague references to going berserk as a purely psychological or physical state. Similarly, the animal transformation aspect often undergoes significant changes. Historical sources suggest that berserkers were believed to take on the spiritual essence of bears or wolves rather than physically changing form. Many popular depictions either literalize this transformation, showing actual shape-shifting, or reduce it to merely wearing animal skins. Both approaches miss the nuanced liminality of the historical concept, where the warrior existed in an ambiguous state between human and animal, without fully becoming either. The social context of berserkers also frequently gets distorted in popular representations. Modern depictions often present them as lone wolf figures, solitary warriors who stand apart from society. Historically, berserkers operated within specific social frameworks, serving kings and jarls as elite units, participating in religious rituals, and occupying complex positions within Norse society. The romantic image of the isolated berserker owes more to modern individualism than to historical reality. Perhaps most significantly, modern depictions tend to either glorify or demonize berserkers without capturing the ambivalence they inspired even within their own culture. Historical sources suggest that while berserkers were valued for their military effectiveness, they were also feared and viewed with suspicion during peacetime. This nuanced cultural position rarely translates to popular representations, which typically present berserkers as either heroic super warriors or mindless, villainous killers. Why do berserkers continue to exert such powerful appeal in contemporary culture? Their enduring resonance stems from several factors that speak to perennial human fascinations. At the most basic level, berserkers represent an extreme expression of martial prowess, the warrior taken to his logical conclusion. In a world where most people experience neither combat nor genuine physical danger, the berserker offers a compelling fantasy of unleashed power and freedom from normal human limitations. More profoundly, berserkers speak to the human fascination with altered states of consciousness. The berserker's ability to transcend normal awareness, to enter a state where ordinary rules and limitations no longer apply, resonates with experiences ranging from religious ecstasy to artistic flow states to intoxication. In an increasingly regulated and rational society, the berserker represents the tantalizing possibility of temporarily escaping the constraints of civilized consciousness. The animal aspect of berserkers taps into another persistent human fascination, our complex relationship with our own animality. Modern humans, increasingly removed from nature and animal existence, often experience a sense of disconnection from their own bodies and instincts. The berserker, embracing animal power and primal rage, offers a fantasy of reconnection with aspects of ourselves that civilization has suppressed or channeled into acceptable forms. The berserker's liminal status, neither fully human nor fully animal, neither fully conscious nor fully unconscious, gives these figures a mythic resonance that transcends their specific historical context. They occupy the borders between categories, embodying the transformative potential of boundary crossing. This liminality makes them natural symbols for processes of change and becoming, for the human potential to transcend current limitations through radical transformation. Beyond these psychological appeals, berserkers offer a compelling narrative device. The berserker rage creates natural dramatic tension. Once unleashed, can it be controlled? Will the character harm friends as well as foes? Will they lose themselves in the process? These questions generate storytelling possibilities that continue to engage audiences across media. The berserker state also provides a convenient explanation for superhuman feats within otherwise relatively realistic narratives, allowing characters to temporarily transcend normal human capabilities without requiring permanent superhuman status. The influence of the berserker concept extends far beyond explicit Viking references, having shaped broader conceptions of the warrior archetype across modern culture. The berserker's legacy can be traced in diverse warrior traditions depicted in entertainment, from samurai who achieve no-mind states in combat to special forces operators who tap into controlled aggression. The fundamental idea of the warrior who accesses extraordinary abilities through altered consciousness has become a cross-cultural trope, with the Norse berserker as perhaps its most vivid historical example. Military and martial arts communities have shown particular interest in the berserker tradition, seeking historical precedents for modern combat psychology concepts. The U.S. Marine Corps' controlled aggression doctrine, which teaches warriors to channel rather than suppress aggressive impulses, bears conceptual similarities to the berserker tradition, though with crucial differences in control and restraint. Similarly, certain martial arts traditions incorporate concepts of fighting spirit or controlled fury that echo berserker principles while emphasizing discipline rather than abandonment to rage. The popularization of berserkers has contributed to broader public interest in Viking history and culture, driving tourism to Scandinavian historical sites and museums. Countries like Norway, Sweden, and Denmark have embraced this interest, developing heritage sites that often include information about berserkers among their exhibits. This economic and cultural impact demonstrates how ancient warrior traditions can find new relevance in contemporary society, contributing to cultural identity and historical identity and historical awareness even centuries after their original context has disappeared. As with many historical concepts that enter popular culture, the modern berserker has evolved into something distinct from its historical antecedent, while retaining core elements that maintain the connection. Today's berserker is simultaneously a historical reference, a psychological archetype, a narrative device, and a marketing phenomenon. This multi-dimensional existence ensures the berserker's continued cultural relevance, while inevitably diluting the specific religious and cultural context that originally defined these extraordinary warriors. The transformation of berserkers from historical figures to cultural icons offers a case study in how ancient concepts adapt to modern sensibilities. Elements that align with contemporary values and interests, extreme physical prowess, psychological transformation, transcendence of limitations, are emphasized and elaborated. Aspects that challenge modern sensibilities, human sacrifice, religious possession, genuinely uncontrolled violence, are typically downplayed or reinterpreted. Through this selective adaptation, ancient warrior traditions maintain their power to fascinate and inspire even as their original context recedes into the distant past. As the morning mist lifts from the ancient battlefield, we stand at the end of our journey through the world of the berserkers. These warriors, who fought with the fury of bears and the hunger of wolves, who transcended normal human limitations through altered states of consciousness, who inspired both awe and terror in friend and foe alike, have led us through a landscape both historical and psychological, both concrete and myth. What remains, beyond the blood-soaked sagas and archaeological fragments, is a legacy that continues to resonate across the centuries, challenging our understanding of human potential and the boundaries of consciousness. The historical significance of berserkers extends far beyond their immediate military impact. While they undoubtedly contributed to Viking battlefield success, their greater importance lies in what they reveal about Norse society and its values. The berserker tradition embodied core elements of pre-Christian Nordic culture: the close relationship between humans and animals, the permeable boundaries between ordinary and divine reality, the value placed on transcendent experiences, and the complex intertwining of religious practice with everyday life, including warfare. In a society where the warrior ethic stood at the center of cultural identity, berserkers represented its most extreme expression. Their willingness to surrender human limitations, to become vessels for divine or animal power, made them living embodiments of the Norse worldview. They existed at the intersection of practical warfare and spiritual practice, demonstrating how thoroughly religion permeated all aspects of Viking life. Unlike modern Western societies, which typically separate spiritual experience from martial activity, the Norse saw these domains as naturally interconnected, with berserkers serving as the most visible manifestation of this integration. The berserker tradition also illuminates the pragmatic adaptability that characterized Viking culture. Rather than viewing altered consciousness as merely recreational or purely religious, Norse society channeled these states toward practical ends. The ability to enter combat trances became a tactical advantage, a specialized military technique that gave Viking forces a psychological edge over their opponents. This practical application of altered states represents a sophisticated understanding of human psychology that many more advanced civilizations failed to develop. As Christianity spread through Scandinavia, the suppression of berserkers reflected broader cultural changes beyond merely religious conversion. The new religion brought with it different conceptions of the relationship between humans and animals, between the individual and divine power, and between consciousness and the body. Where berserkers had embodied a worldview in which humans could temporarily become something other than human, Christian theology emphasized fixed boundaries between categories: human and animal, natural and supernatural, body and soul. This shift represents one of history's most profound psychological transformations, a fundamental reorganization of how an entire culture understood consciousness and identity. The Berserker, as a figure who routinely crossed these newly hardened boundaries, became not just religiously problematic, but conceptually impossible within the new framework. Their disappearance marked not simply the end of a military tradition, but the closing of an entire way of experiencing reality. The legacy of Berserkers in shaping the historical image of Vikings cannot be overstated. When modern people envision Vikings, they often picture wild-eyed warriors in animal skins, fighting with unstoppable fury. Essentially, they picture Berserkers rather than ordinary Norse fighters. This selective memory is not accidental. The Berserker, as the most extreme and distinctive element of Viking warfare, naturally attracted disproportionate attention in both contemporary accounts and later histories. This distortion cuts both ways. Christian chroniclers emphasize Berserkers to portray Vikings as savage and demonic, supporting anti-Norse propaganda. Later, Romantic nationalists highlighted Berserkers to celebrate Norse martial prowess and mystical connection to nature. In both cases, the extraordinary became mistaken for the ordinary, with Berserkers actually specialized elite warriors, taken as representative of Vikings generally. This pattern reminds us how historical memory selectively preserves the exceptional rather than the typical. The average Viking was not a berserker, but a practical fighter who relied on shield wall tactics, who felt pain and fear like any human, and who fought primarily for practical rewards rather than religious ecstasy. By focusing excessively on berserkers, we risk misunderstanding the broader Viking phenomenon, much as focusing only on special forces would give a distorted picture of modern military operations. Nevertheless, Berserkers have become an indelible part of the Viking brand, one that continues to fascinate modern audiences precisely because of its extremity. Their appeal lies partly in how they embody qualities both admired and feared: total commitment, transcendence of physical limitations, and a complete surrender to purpose that borders on the sublime. In a world increasingly characterized by hesitancy, qualification, and ironic distance, the Berserker represents a radical alternative, the possibility of wholehearted engagement pushed to its ultimate conclusion. The spiritual legacy of Berserkers raises profound questions about human potential and the malleability of consciousness. Their practices demonstrated that ordinary awareness represents only one possible configuration of human consciousness, that through specific techniques, whether chemical, psychological, or spiritual, people can access radically different states of being. This insight, commonplace in many traditional cultures, but frequently forgotten in modern industrialized societies, continues to resurface through various avenues, from extreme sports to psychedelic research to meditation traditions. The Berserker state, while directed toward violence, shares fundamental features with transcendent states reported across cultures and eras. Dissolution of ordinary identity, altered perception of time and sensation, access to seemingly superhuman capabilities, and a sense of connection to something beyond the individual self. These parallels suggest that the Berserker phenomenon tapped into basic neurological and psychological potentials common to all humans, rather than representing a purely cultural construction. This universality helps explain why similar warrior traditions emerged independently across diverse cultures. From the Malay running amok to the Hawaiian Koa warriors, to the Japanese samurai's concept of mushin, no mind. Specialized fighters worldwide discovered comparable techniques for transcending normal limitations through altered consciousness. These cross-cultural parallels suggest that the Berserker state represents not a Norse peculiarity, but a rediscovery of human potential that emerges whenever societies face the extreme demands of close combat warfare. The Berserker tradition also offers insights into the complex relationship between humans and animals. In modern Western thought, a sharp distinction typically separates human from animal consciousness, with human identity defined partly through this differentiation. The Berserker tradition presented a radical alternative to this binary thinking, suggesting that humans could temporarily take on animal qualities without losing their fundamental humanity. This perspective aligns with recent scientific findings about human cognition. Neuroscience increasingly recognizes that our brains contain ancient structures shared with other mammals, responsible for emotional responses, aggression, and other animal behaviors. Rather than standing apart from our evolutionary heritage, humans build upon it, with newer brain regions modulating but not replacing older ones. In this light, the berserker state might be understood as temporarily shifting the balance between these neural systems, reducing prefrontal inhibition, while amplifying ancient survival circuits. The berserker thus embodies an uncomfortable truth. The animal remains within the human, not as something foreign but as an integral part of our nature. By embracing, rather than denying this reality, Norse culture developed techniques for channeling these primal energies toward cultural ends. In contrast, societies that more rigidly separate human from animal may paradoxically find themselves less equipped to manage the inevitable eruptions of these fundamental aspects of human nature. This insight has implications far beyond historical interest. Modern societies continue to struggle with the management of aggression and violence, often adopting strategies based on suppression rather than channeling. The Berserker tradition, while certainly not offering a direct template for contemporary applications, suggests the potential value of acknowledging and ritually containing primal energies, rather than pretending they don't exist or can be eliminated through moral injunction alone. The ethical dimensions of the Berserker phenomenon deserve particular attention. From a modern perspective, warriors who deliberately entered states of reduced moral awareness and heightened aggression raise troubling questions about combat ethics and responsibility. Yet, judging berserkers by contemporary standards misses the radically different ethical framework within which they operated. In Norse culture, courage and loyalty often outweighed restraint as martial virtues. The berserker's willingness to sacrifice normal human limitations for the sake of his comrades and lord could be seen as the ultimate expression of warrior dedication. Within a religious context that valued dying gloriously in battle above all else, the berserker's embrace of battle frenzy represented not an abdication of responsibility, but its fullest realization. This ethical framework, while alien to modern sensibilities, reminds us that moral systems are not universal constants, but culturally embedded structures that evolve through time. The Berserker invites us to consider how completely our ethical intuitions are shaped by our particular historical and cultural position, challenging the assumption that contemporary moral frameworks represent the culmination of ethical development rather than simply another stage in its ongoing evolution. The psychological cost of Berserker Gang raises another dimension of ethical reflection. The sagas frequently describe berserkers suffering after battle, experiencing extreme exhaustion, vulnerability, and sometimes psychological disturbances following their frenzy. These descriptions suggest an intuitive understanding that transcendent states, especially those involving violence, exact a price from those who experience them. Modern combat psychology confirms this ancient wisdom. Research on contemporary soldiers shows that killing in combat, even when legally and morally sanctioned, often produces psychological trauma. The temporary states of altered consciousness that many soldiers report during intense combat, time distortion, sensory filtering, emotional detachment, frequently give way to post-traumatic symptoms once the immediate danger has passed. The Berserker tradition, with its recognition of post-battle vulnerability, shows a sophisticated understanding of these psychological dynamics centuries before formal trauma theory emerged. This pattern reveals a deeper truth about consciousness itself. States that temporarily override normal human limitations often require subsequent integration and recovery, whether through religious ecstasy, psychedelic experience, extreme physical exertion, or combat intensity. Temporarily accessing extraordinary capabilities typically demands a corresponding period of restoration. The berserker cycle of frenzy followed by exhaustion reflects this fundamental rhythm of altered consciousness, a pattern recognized by wisdom traditions worldwide, but often overlooked in modern approaches to peak performance. The berserker tradition also invites reflection on the relationship between individual and collective consciousness. While often portrayed as solitary fighters in modern depictions, historical berserkers typically operated in groups. Their frenzy, at least partly a collective phenomenon, reinforced through shared rituals and mutual entrainment. This social dimension reminds us that consciousness itself exists not solely within individual brains, but in the spaces between people, shaped by cultural expectations and group dynamics. The Norse understanding of Berserkergang as divine possession, rather than purely individual achievement, reflects this recognition of consciousness as partly transpersonal. The modern tendency to locate all mental phenomena within individual neurology may miss important dimensions of experience that emerge from collective contexts. The berserker, understood as a vessel for something beyond himself rather than merely an extraordinary individual, challenges our contemporary emphasis on isolated selfhood as the fundamental unit of consciousness. As we look toward future research directions, several intriguing questions about berserkers remain unresolved. Archaeological advances in residue analysis may eventually provide more definitive evidence about substances used in berserker preparations. Cognitive neuroscience continues to develop more sophisticated models of altered states that might illuminate the neural mechanisms behind combat trance. Comparative anthropology offers opportunities to identify patterns across warrior traditions worldwide that could clarify universal aspects of the berserker phenomenon. Beyond academic research, practical applications of berserker-related insights continue to emerge in fields ranging from military training to performance psychology to therapeutic approaches for trauma. While few advocate literally recreating berserker practices, the underlying principles, controlled application of altered states, recognition of human-animal continuity, integration of spiritual and practical dimensions of experience, find new expressions adapted to contemporary contexts and values. As we close this exploration, perhaps the most profound legacy of berserkers lies in how they challenge our assumptions about human nature itself. These warriors from 1,000 years ago demonstrate that human consciousness contains far more possibilities than our ordinary experience suggests, that the boundaries we take for granted between human and animal, individual and collective, natural and supernatural, may be more permeable than we typically recognize. In their battle frenzy, berserkers glimpsed realities beyond ordinary awareness, accessed capabilities beyond normal human limitations, and embodied truths about our nature that we often prefer to forget. Their example reminds us that what we call normal consciousness represents not the totality of human possibility, but merely one configuration among many, shaped as much by cultural conditioning as by biological necessity. This recognition of greater human potential carries both promise and warning. The berserker state channeled extraordinary capabilities toward violence and domination, yet the underlying capacity for transcending ordinary limitations might be directed toward other ends. The same malleability of consciousness that produced the battlefield frenzy might, with different intention and context, generate experiences of profound compassion, creativity, or insight. The berserker thus stands as both historical reality and enduring metaphor, a reminder of the extraordinary plasticity of human nature and the responsibility that comes with this freedom. In these ancient warriors who fought between worlds, who moved between human and animal, between ordinary and divine consciousness, we encounter not merely an artifact of a vanished culture, but a mirror reflecting our own unrealized possibilities and unacknowledged capacities. Their legacy challenges us to recognize both the grandeur and the terror of what it means to be human, with all the transformative potential that entails. Thank you for following this deep dive into the world of the Viking Berserkers. If you enjoyed this glimpse into the wildest side of Viking history, please consider liking this video, subscribing to Insomnia History, and sharing your thoughts in the comments below. Your support helps us continue uncovering these forgotten stories from the shadows of the past. Until next time, this has been Insomnia History.